In 1908, in an office inside the Masonic Temple building in downtown Chicago, a small book went on sale. 212 pages, cheap binding. And where the author's name should have been, there was nothing. Just 3 words, 3 initiates. The book claimed to carry a teaching 5,000 years old. It said the teaching came out of Egypt, from a figure the Greeks called Hermes Trismegistus, and the Egyptians called Thoth. And it opened with a claim that sounds insane until you sit with it for about 10 minutes. Everything you think is solid, your body, your bank balance, the chair holding you up right now, is a thought occurring inside a mind that is not yours. That book has never gone out of print, not for a single year since. It ran into Napoleon Hill. It ran into the self-help explosion of the 1950s. It ran into black nationalist study circles, into modern witchcraft, and into the entire manifestation economy sitting in your pocket right now. If you have ever heard anyone say that the universe is mental, or that thought becomes thing, you have heard this book. You just did not know its name. But there is a problem with all of it. The man who almost certainly wrote that book was not an Egyptian priest, and he was not an initiate of anything. He was a Chicago attorney named William Walker Atkinson, who had already lost his health, his money, and his practice to overwork, and who built himself back from zero. And the forgery is not the strange part. The strange part is that it works. That book has rebuilt more lives than most authentic scripture. And the reason why has been sitting inside the book's own first principle, in plain sight, for 117 years. To understand it, you have to go back a very long way, not to Chicago, to a stretch of desert above the Nile where the Egyptians buried 4 million birds. Chapter 1. The God who invented writing. His name was not Thoth. That is the Greek version, and the Greeks arrived late. The Egyptians called him Jehuti. We do not know exactly how it was pronounced, because written Egyptian does not record its vowels, so every version you have ever heard is a scholarly reconstruction. Egyptologists usually say something close to Jehuti. The name most likely means something like, he who is like the ibis. And once you have seen an ibis, that stops being poetic and starts being practical. The bird has a long, thin, curved beak that hangs down toward the ground, like a reed pen dipping into ink. They gave the god of writing the head of the bird that looked like a writing instrument. That is not mysticism. That is somebody paying attention. His city was Kamunu, in Middle Egypt. The Greeks would later rename it Hermopolis, and that renaming is the hinge this entire story turns on, so hold on to it. Now, if you grew up anywhere in the modern West, you probably have a category in your head for what a wisdom god does. He sits somewhere elevated, he says cryptic things, and people write them down. Jehuti does not work like that. The Egyptian sources are almost aggressively unromantic about him. He is not a mystic. He is an administrator. He is the scribe of the gods. He keeps the records. He invented writing, which the Egyptians called MDW Netjer, the words of the god, and which we mangled into hieroglyphs. He measured the heavens and counted the earth. He divided time and sorted out the calendar. And when the gods went to court, which in Egyptian myth was constantly, Jehuti was the one drafting the paperwork and proposing the compromise that stopped Horus and Set from destroying each other. He is the god of the guy who actually does the work. And then there is the job that made him terrifying. When an Egyptian died, they believed the heart was placed on a scale and weighed against a single ostrich feather, the feather of Ma'at, which was the Egyptian word for truth, balance, order, the way things are supposed to be. Anubis worked the scales. Osiris sat in judgment. And Jehudi stood off to the side with his palette, writing down the result. Think about what that arrangement actually says. The Egyptians did not put the god of wisdom in charge of the verdict. They put him in charge of the record. Because to them, wisdom was not the power to decide what is true. Wisdom was the discipline of writing down what is true, whether or not you like it. That is a harder standard than anything modern self-help will ask of you. Now, how seriously did they take this god? There is an answer to that. And it is buried in the sand outside his own city. The necropolis at Tuna El Gebel is a set of underground galleries that go on for kilometers. And inside them, stacked in pottery jars, floor to ceiling, corridor after corridor, are mummified ibises. Not dozens, not thousands. Archaeologists have put the estimate in the millions. And the same thing turns up in the cemeteries near Memphis. Millions of birds, caught, killed, embalmed with the same care you would give a person, wrapped in linen and left in the dark as offerings to the god who invented writing. Whatever you personally believe about any of this, you cannot argue with that number. A civilization does not do that by accident. They believed that recorded knowledge was the single most valuable substance in existence, and they were willing to spend centuries of labor saying so. Which brings us to the books. The Egyptians had a legend about the writings of Thoth, and it is not the legend you would expect from a wisdom tradition. It is a horror story. The best surviving version comes from a demotic tale about a prince named Setne Kamwas. And Setne was a real historical figure, a son of Rameses II, who worked as a high priest and restored old monuments. In the story, he hears about a book written by Thoth himself, sealed in a tomb. 2 spells in it. One lets you command the earth, the sky, the mountains, and the waters. The other lets you see the gods directly. So Setne goes and takes it. And the tale spends the rest of its length showing him what that costs. The previous owner had already been destroyed by it, along with his wife and his child. Setne is dragged through a sequence of humiliation and loss so complete that by the end he is crawling back to the tomb to put the book back where he found it. The Egyptians were telling their own priesthood something specific with that story. Knowledge is not neutral. Knowledge that you have not earned will take you apart, because you are not built to hold it yet. The problem was never the information. The problem was the container. Every serious tradition eventually arrives at that same conclusion, and every generation of beginners refuses to believe it. So that is Jehudi, ibis-headed, unglamorous, obsessive about records, guarding books that ruin the people who steal them. For roughly 3,000 years, he stayed inside Egypt. He was not an export. There was no missionary program. If you wanted his teaching, you learned Egyptian, you entered a temple school, and you spent your life there. But before we follow him out of Egypt, go back to that scale one more time. Because we have only looked at the man holding the pen. We have not looked at what he was measuring against. Chapter 2. 42 Questions. Before we leave Egypt, I want to give you the one part of this entire video that is not a forgery. Everything coming after this chapter is contested. Anonymous authors, missing originals, invented sources. But what I am about to describe is verified, well documented, and thousands of years old. And it is the most demanding thing in this video. The Egyptians had a word, Ma'at, and we do not have a clean equivalent. It gets translated as truth, or justice, or order, or balance. And every one of those is a fragment of it. Ma'at was the correct functioning of everything. The Nile arriving on schedule. the sun completing its circuit, a judge ruling honestly, a man doing what he said he would do. Its opposite was Isfet, which meant chaos, disorder, injustice, and the slow decay of things that should hold together. And the Egyptians understood something about that pair which took the rest of the world a long time to work out. Mahat was not the default. Isfet was. Order was not what happened when you left things alone. Order was a thing that had to be actively produced, every single day, by everyone, at every level, or it drained away. The pharaoh's actual job description was upholding Mayat. And if he failed at it, the Nile would fail, and the country would come apart. Sit with that, because it is the least comfortable idea in Egyptian religion, and it is completely correct. Nothing good in your life is self-maintaining. Not your body, not your work, not your relationships, not your attention. Every one of them is a structure being held up against a constant downward pressure, and the moment you stop feeding effort into it, it does not freeze in place. It degrades. There is no maintenance mode. There is building, and there is erosion. And if you are not doing the first one, you are experiencing the second. Now here is how they operationalized it, and this is where it stops being philosophy. When you died, the texts say you entered a chamber called the Hall of Two Truths, and waiting in that room were 42 judges, one for each district of Egypt, and you had to address every single one of them by name. What you said to them survives. It is written out in spell 125 of the Book of the Dead, and Egyptologists call it the Negative Confession, or the Declarations of Innocence. And the first thing you notice about it is the grammar. It is not a list of achievements. Nobody stands in that room and reads out their accomplishments. There is no section where you describe your titles, your monuments, or the size of your estate. Every single declaration is a denial of a specific harm. I have not stolen. I have not killed. I have not lied. I have not caused anyone to weep. I have not been deaf to words of truth. And then it gets weirdly specific, which is the part I find genuinely moving. I have not moved the boundary stones of a field. I have not tampered with the weights on a scale. I have not driven cattle off temple land. I have not dammed running water. I have not put out a fire that should have been burning. Look at what those actually are. Moving a boundary stone steals from your neighbor a few inches at a time in a way nobody can prove. Tampering with a weight cheats every customer slightly. Damming water in an irrigation society takes from everyone downstream and looks like nothing. Those are not dramatic crimes. Those are the small, deniable, almost invisible ways an ordinary person degrades the system everybody else is standing on. The Egyptians built their final judgment around exactly that category. Not the sins that make a good story, the ones you could get away with forever and probably have. And then, after you have said all 42, they weigh you anyway. Because talk was understood to be cheap in Egypt too. Your heart goes on the scale. And the reason it is the heart specifically is that the Egyptians did not locate thought in the brain. For them, the heart, the ib, was where thinking happened, where memory lived, where character accumulated. The heart was the organ that had been present for every decision you ever made and had recorded all of them. So the test is not whether you can describe yourself accurately. The test is whether the thing that watched you your whole life agrees with your description. And here is the detail that tells you how seriously they took this. Egyptians were buried with heart scarabs. Carved stone beetles placed over the heart and inscribed on them was a spell. The spell is addressed to your own heart, and it asks the heart, essentially, not to stand up and testify against you. Think about what that means. They were not afraid of the judges. They were afraid of the accurate internal record. And they went into the tomb carrying a written plea asking it to stay quiet. 3,500 years ago, people were paying craftsmen to carve them away to shut up the part of themselves that knew the truth. If the heart came in heavier than the feather, it was fed to a creature called Amit, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, crouched beside the scales waiting. And what happened then was not punishment. There is no Egyptian hell, no eternal torment, nothing designed to hurt you. If your heart was eaten, you simply stopped existing, erased. No afterlife, no memory, no name. The Egyptians considered annihilation worse than any suffering they could imagine, and they were probably right. So that is the actual Egyptian system. And I want you to notice how little of it looks like what gets sold under the word Egyptian today. No secret knowledge, no hidden initiation, no emerald tablets, 42 ordinary questions about whether you cheated people in small ways when it was easy, weighed against a feather, recorded by a god with the head of a bird. That standard held for 3,000 years without a single secret society attached to it. No initiation, no hidden lineage, no sealed vault. 42 questions, written down, available to anyone who could read. And then, in 332 BCE, a 24-year-old Macedonian walked into Egypt without a fight, and everything about that arrangement ended. Chapter 3. The Merger. Alexander took Egypt, founded a city on the coast with his name on it, and died 9 years later. His general Ptolemy took the country and started a dynasty that ran it for the next 3 centuries, ending with Cleopatra. What happened next is one of the more underrated events in intellectual history, and it happened without anybody planning it. When Greeks encountered a foreign religion, they did not usually treat it as competition. They treated it as translation. They assumed every people worshiped the same gods under different names, and they went looking for matches. Historians call this interpretatio graeca, and it was applied to Egypt with enormous confidence and very little caution. So they looked at Jehuti, god of writing, messenger between the divine and the human, guide who escorts souls in the afterlife. And they looked at their own Hermes, god of language and interpretation, messenger of the gods, guide who escorts souls to the underworld, same job description, different accent. Kamunu became Hermopolis, the city of Hermes, and the 2 gods fused into one figure who was neither of them, a composite the Greeks called Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes the thrice great. Now that title sounds like it was handed down from some cosmic hierarchy. It was not. Egyptian used repetition where we use intensifiers, so an important god got called Great, Great, and Jehuti, in some inscriptions, got stacked up to Great, Great, Great. The Greeks read that, looked for a word, and landed on Trismegistus. The most famous mystical title in Western esotericism is a translator doing his best with an Egyptian grammar habit. And under that composite name, somewhere in Roman Egypt between roughly 100 and 300 of the Common Era, a group of anonymous writers produced the documents that everything after this is built on. 17 Greek treatises. We call them the Corpus Hermeticum. Nobody knows who wrote them. They are not by one author, they do not entirely agree with each other. And they were composed in Greek by people living in Egypt who were working with both traditions at once. And the first one is a genuine piece of writing. It is called the Poims Mandres, and it opens with the narrator drifting off, not meditating, not fasting on a mountain, just tired and half asleep, when something enormous starts speaking to him. The voice identifies itself as nous. The word gets translated as mind or intellect, and neither one carries it properly. Nepos is not the thing you use to do arithmetic. It is the intelligence that the universe is made out of, and your own thinking is a small local instance of it. What Nhos shows him is a creation account, then a descent. Mind produces the cosmos. A being made of light looks down into the material world, sees its own reflection, falls in love with it, and drops. And it becomes us. Which is why, according to this text, a human being is a permanent contradiction, mortal in the body and immortal underneath it, and miserable precisely because both halves are real. The way back up is not belief. The hermetic word is gnosis, which means direct knowledge, the kind you get from experience rather than from being told. And the instruction it gives is the same one carved on the temple at Delphi and repeated by every serious teacher since. Know yourself. And they did not mean that as a nice sentiment, they meant it as the actual mechanism. If your mind is a local instance of the mind that runs everything, then the deepest available research project is inward, and nobody else can do the field work for you. That is the seed. Everything in the next 1900 years grows out of that one idea. But there is a second hermetic text you need to know about, and it is the one that gets me every time. It survives in a work called the Asclepius, and inside it there is a passage scholars simply call the Lament. In it, Hermes tells his student that a time is coming when Egypt will forget itself. The temples will fall silent. The gods will withdraw and go back to heaven. Foreigners will fill the land, and reverence for the sacred will be treated as a criminal act. The country that was the image of heaven, he says, will become a land of tombs, full of nothing but the dead. Read that as prophecy if you want. I think it is something more painful than prophecy. Those writers were watching it happen. Roman Egypt was already squeezing the temple system out of existence. The old priesthood was collapsing under economic pressure, and the men writing these documents knew their civilization had a shelf life. That is not a prediction. That is a suicide note written by a culture and left where somebody might find it. They were right. And it took about 300 years. In 391, the Emperor Theodosius shut the pagan temples across the empire. The great Serapeum at Alexandria was torn apart. And in 394, on the island of Philae, a priest carved a message into the wall of the Temple of Isis. It is the last dated hieroglyphic inscription anyone has ever found. 3,500 years of continuous writing. And there is a final entry, and then nothing. The Greek hermetic texts went with it. In the Latin-speaking West, almost the entire corpus disappeared. For roughly 1,000 years, European scholars had access to essentially one hermetic document, and they no longer understood what tradition it came out of. The teaching was dead. The originals were gone. And then, about 400 years later, more than 2,000 miles away, in Arabic, it came back. In the hands of a man describing a corpse on a golden throne. Chapter 4. The Jar. I want to jump forward 1,500 years, because there is one moment in this whole story where the missing original almost turns up, and it happened within living memory. December 1945. Upper Egypt, at the base of a limestone cliff called the Jabal al-Tarif, about 7 miles from a town called Nag Hammadi. A group of local farmers were out digging for sabak, which is a soft nitrate-rich soil they used as fertilizer. They were working around the base of a boulder when a mattock hit something that was not rock. It was a sealed clay jar, red earthenware, close to 1 meter tall. The man usually credited with the find, Muhammad Ali al-Saman, said later that he hesitated before breaking it open. He was worried a jinn might be sealed inside. Then he considered that it might be full of gold instead, and he swung the mattock. No gold? What came out of the jar was paper. 13 leather-bound papyrus codices, around 50 separate texts written in Coptic, which is Egyptian language written in Greek letters, copied out in the 4th century from Greek originals a century or two older than that. That jar is one of the most significant manuscript discoveries of the 20th century. It contained the only complete surviving copy of the Gospel of Thomas. It contained an entire library of texts that the early church had suppressed so thoroughly that scholars had known them only from the writings of the people attacking them. And buried in Codex 6, sitting alongside all of that, were 3 hermetic texts. One of them had never been seen before by anyone in modern times. It is called the Discourse on the 8th and the 9th. And it is a record of an initiation. A teacher walking a student through the final stages of the ascent, level by level, with the student describing what he is experiencing as it happens. And what it describes is not what you would expect from a secret Egyptian text. There is no ritual equipment in it, no sacrifice, no apparatus, no substances. The teacher tells the student to be quiet, and then to keep being quiet. And the student keeps reporting that he cannot find words for what is happening. At the peak of it, the language breaks down into strings of vowels, which scholars think were sung rather than spoken. The whole document is 2 men sitting in a room, and one of them running out of vocabulary. That is what 1,500 years of burial preserved. Not a spell for gold, and not a machine for controlling anyone. A transcript of somebody trying and failing to describe an internal state to their teacher, which is the same problem every serious practitioner in every tradition has always run into. For centuries, the entire argument about Hermeticism had been an argument about texts that Europeans had inherited through a very long chain of copying. Then some farmers digging for fertilizer broke a pot open, and there it was. 4th century Egyptian copies of hermetic material, buried in the sand, untouched since late antiquity. The tradition was real. People had genuinely been practicing this in Egypt. It was not invented in Florence, and it was not invented in Chicago. But now here is the part that makes this chapter belong in this video, and it is almost funny. We do not actually know that story is true. The scholar James Robinson tracked down Muhammad Ali in the 1970s and interviewed him about the discovery. And Muhammad Ali told him a story that involved a blood feud, a killing, and a reason to keep quiet about where he had been that week. Then he told it again, with different details. Over successive retellings, the number of men present at the discovery went from 2 to 8. Sometimes the codices were in a jar. Sometimes they were beside a body. Sometimes in a cave, sometimes in a tomb. Sometimes behind a rock. His mother reportedly burned some of the pages in her oven before anyone realized what they were. The rest went on to the Cairo Antiquities black market and got scattered across dealers, and one codex ended up in Zurich before eventually being reunited with the others. There is a serious body of scholarship now arguing that the entire Fine story is unreliable, and that the real chain of custody runs back through antiquities dealers who had every reason to invent a clean origin for what they were selling. So the manuscripts are genuine. Nobody disputes the codices themselves. They have been carbon dated, analyzed, and translated, and they sit in the Coptic Museum in Cairo where anyone can go and look at them. But the story of how they reached us is smoke. Again, that is now 4 times. And in about 10 minutes, we will make it 5. Chapter 5. The Tablet in the Tomb. While Europe was losing the thread, the Islamic world was picking it up. By the late 700s, Baghdad had become the most intellectually serious city on the planet. There was an organized, state-funded effort to hunt down Greek manuscripts across the old Byzantine and Persian territories and translate them into Arabic. Medicine, astronomy, mathematics, philosophy. Anything that could be found, translated, argued with, and improved. And somewhere in that flood of translated material, a text surfaced under the name Balinas. Scholars usually call him Pseudo-Apollonius of Tyana, because he is writing under the borrowed name of a Greek philosopher from centuries earlier. Nobody knows who he actually was. His book is called the Kitab Sir al-Khaliqa, which comes out as something like the Book of the Secret of Creation and the Art of Nature, and it was probably assembled somewhere between 750 and 850. Inside it is a story. Balinas says he found a hidden chamber beneath a ruined temple of Hermes. He went down into it, and at the bottom, in the dark, there was a golden throne. Seated on the throne was a corpse, dry, preserved, undisturbed. And in its hands it was holding a tablet cut from green stone. That tablet is the Emerald Tablet, the Tabula Smaragdina, and what is carved on it is somewhere around 13 lines long, depending on which version you read, which makes it one of the shortest documents ever to reshape an entire intellectual tradition. The most famous line in it is the one you already know, even if you have never opened a book about any of this. As above, so below. 4 words that have been printed on more tattoos, album covers, and Instagram posts than probably any other sentence in Western esotericism. And almost everybody who repeats it has the wrong idea about what it was for. Because the Emerald Tablet is not a poem. It reads like a poem, and that is deliberate. But the men who copied it for 800 years were not reading it for inspiration. They were reading it as an instruction set. Look at what the rest of the text actually tells you to do. Separate the earth from the fire. Separate the subtle from the gross, gently, with great care and attention. Take the thing up from the earth to the sky, and then bring it back down to the earth again. And in doing that, the power of the thing increases. Now, if you have ever done any distillation, you already recognize that. Heat a mixture. The volatile fraction rises as vapor, which is the ascent. It cools against the glass and falls back down as a liquid, which is the descent. Do it again and again. Each cycle strips out more of what you did not want and concentrates what you did. The Emerald Tablet is describing distillation and spiritual refinement in the same breath, deliberately, using one set of instructions to cover both. That is what, as above, so below, was built to do. It was not a nice thought about cosmic harmony. It was a working claim that the same operation runs on every level of reality. So if you understand what happens in the flask, you understand what happens in the soul. And if you know what happens in the soul, you can predict what happens in the flask. Whether or not that claim is true, notice what it demands of you. It means there is no such thing as a purely technical skill, and no such thing as a purely spiritual one. The way you handle a difficult morning and the way you handle a difficult career are the same operation running at different scales. Get good at the small version, and the large version comes with it. From there, the tablet travels, and the route is worth tracing, because it explains how this material reached you. An early version turns up attached to a work credited to Jabir ibn Hayyan, the towering figure of Arabic alchemy. the man Europe would later call Geber. In the 12th century, a Spanish monk named Hugo of Santalla puts it into Latin, and Latin is the operating system of educated Europe. It gets folded into the Secretum Secretorum, a book of advice supposedly written by Aristotle for Alexander the Great, which was one of the most widely copied texts of the entire Middle Ages. So the tablet smuggles itself into Europe inside a leadership manual for kings. Nobody had to promote it. It arrived in the luggage of a bestseller. And 400 years later, in a study in Cambridge, a man sits down and copies it out in English in his own handwriting. That man is Isaac Newton. His translation of the Emerald Tablet still exists, sitting in his alchemical papers at King's College, Cambridge. The person who worked out gravity and built the mathematical foundation of modern physics spent an enormous fraction of his working life on alchemy and on texts exactly like this one. Not as a hobby he was embarrassed about. He wrote more words on alchemy and theology than he ever wrote on physics. The economist John Maynard Keynes bought a trunk of Newton's unpublished papers at auction in 1936, read through them, and said afterwards that Newton was not the first scientist of the Age of Reason. He was the last of the magicians, which is the pattern I want you to see, because it is about to repeat. Every serious thinker who came into contact with this material treated it as the deepest thing they had ever read. And in every single case, the original document was missing. Belinas found the tablet in a tomb and could not produce it. The Greek text he claimed to be translating from does not exist and probably never did. The Egyptians, whose wisdom it supposedly preserved, had been dead for centuries by the time anyone wrote it down. 3 times now. Same shape, a teaching of overwhelming importance, and no chain of custody. And in 1460, in Florence, it happened again, on the largest scale yet. This time it would take Europe 150 years to notice. Chapter 6. Florence, 1463. Cosimo de' Medici was the richest and most influential private citizen in Europe, and by 1460 he was old, sick, and running out of time. He had spent a fortune buying manuscripts. He had agents in the Eastern Mediterranean, whose only job was to find old Greek texts and get them back to Florence. And he had a young scholar on the payroll named Marsilio Ficino, probably the finest Greek reader in Italy, whom he had commissioned to do something nobody had done before: translate the complete works of Plato into Latin. That was the project. That was going to be Cosimo's legacy. And then a monk arrived from Macedonia, carrying a Greek manuscript, and Cosimo read what it was, and he told Ficino to stop. Put Plato down. Translate this first. Understand what a strange order that is. He is telling the best classicist of his generation to abandon Plato, the foundation of Western philosophy, for an unknown text nobody had read in 1,000 years. He did it because of a belief historians call Prisca Theologia, the ancient theology. The idea was that God had given a single, original revelation to humanity at the beginning, that fragments of it survived, scattered through every culture, and that the older a text was, the closer it sat to that original source. And they believed Hermes Trismegistus was older than everyone. Older than Plato. Older than Pythagoras. Older, Cosimo thought, than Moses. If that is true, then translating Plato before Hermes is like reading a student's essay before you read the textbook he copied it from. Cosimo was dying, and he wanted the source. Ficino finished the translation in 1463. Cosimo lived long enough to read it, and died the following year. The Latin version went to press in 1471, and it detonated. By the end of the 16th century, there were more than 20 printed editions in circulation. It ran through Pico della Mirandola. It ran through Giordano Bruno. It reshaped what educated Europeans thought philosophy even was. Because here, apparently, was a body of non-Christian mystical theology older than the Bible that somehow anticipated Christian ideas anyway. There is a long-running argument among historians, and I will be straight with you that it is genuinely contested, about how much this material fed into the birth of modern science. The strongest version of the claim, associated with the historian Francis Yates, says Renaissance Hermeticism gave Europe permission to believe the universe was a system with hidden rules that a human being could work out and then operate. Plenty of scholars think Yates pushed it too far. But even the cautious version of that argument leaves you with something uncomfortable. The people who built the early modern world were reading this stuff seriously, and it changed what they thought was possible. Giordano Bruno went furthest with it. He argued for an infinite universe, other worlds with other life on them, and a version of hermetic religion he thought should replace Christianity outright. In 1600, the Roman Inquisition burned him alive in the Campo de' Fiori for it. His statue still stands on the spot where they lit the fire. 14 years after they killed him, a Swiss scholar sitting in London proved the whole foundation was wrong. His name was Isaac Casaubon, and he was not trying to destroy Hermeticism. He was working on something else entirely, a Protestant demolition of a Catholic history of the Church, written by Cardinal Cesare Baronio. In 1614 he published it, and in the middle of that enormous polemic, almost in passing, he turned his attention to the Corpus Hermeticum. Casaubon was a philologist. His speciality was language itself, the way vocabulary and phrasing shift across centuries and leave fingerprints. And what he did was so simple, it is almost insulting. He read the Greek, demiurge, nous, logos, ogdoad. These are not words that could have been used by an Egyptian priest thousands of years before Plato. They are technical terms from Hellenistic Greek philosophy, which means the vocabulary of the text is centuries younger than the text claims to be. The prose rhythm matched late Greek writing. Some passages appeared to be aware of ideas that only existed after Christianity did. His conclusion was flat and unarguable. The Corpus Hermeticum was written in the early centuries of the Common Era, in Greek, in Roman Egypt. It is a genuine, ancient document. It is simply about 1,500 years younger than everyone believed, and it is not a survival from the age of the pharaohs. 150 years of European intellectual authority gone on the strength of one man's vocabulary list. And now the part that should bother you, in a good way. It did not matter. By 1614, the damage, or the gift, depending on how you look at it, was already done. Bruno was ash. Ficino was long dead. But the ideas had been loose in Europe for 150 years, and they had already gone into the water supply. Kepler, Newton, and half the founding generation of modern science had been shaped by an intellectual climate that this forgery helped create. The dating was wrong. The influence was real. Nobody went back and Jung thought their thoughts because a philologist in London found the wrong nouns, which gives you one of the strangest facts in the history of ideas. Some of the most productive thinking Europe ever did was built on a document that was not what anyone thought it was. The error was not a bug in the process. For about 2 centuries, the error was the engine. Hold on to that, because in about 20 minutes, it is going to become the whole point of this video. Quick thing before the next part, and then I will leave you alone. Everything from here is the practical section. 7 principles, 1 master key, and the discipline each of them actually demands. If this is the kind of breakdown you want more of, subscribe. That is the only thing I am going to ask you for. Now, the man in Chicago. Chapter 7. The first 4 keys. So here is the book itself. 212 pages, published in Chicago in 1908, and structured around 7 statements it calls the hermetic principles. I'm going to take you through all 7, and for each one, I am going to do 3 things. Tell you what the book actually claims. Tell you the honest version of what that claim is worth. And tell you what it demands from you if you take it seriously. Because that last part is where almost everyone bails out. Principle 1. Mentalism. The book states it in 7 words. The all is mind. The universe is mental. The claim is that everything you can perceive, matter, energy, time, your own body, exists as a thought inside a single infinite mind, and that your individual mind is a smaller instance of the same substance. Not a metaphor. The book means it literally. Now, whether that is true is a question about the deep structure of reality that nobody has settled and nobody is going to settle in the next 30 seconds. So let me give you the version you can actually test. Whatever the universe is made of, your access to it runs entirely through interpretation. There is no route to any event that does not pass through the machinery that decides what the event means. 2 people lose the same job on the same day. One of them experiences a catastrophe, and the other experiences a release. Same event. The difference in outcome over the next 5 years is enormous. And it was produced by interpretation, not by circumstance. That is the operational core of mentalism, and it is not soft. It is the single hardest claim in the book to actually live with, because it takes away your excuse. Here is what it demands. You do not get to choose most of what happens to you. You do get to choose the frame you put around it, and choosing the frame is not a nice inner exercise you do once. It is continuous, effortful, and it fails constantly. Every reframe decays. You have to do it again, tomorrow. And I want to be blunt about the place where this goes wrong, because it goes wrong at industrial scale. Mentalism does not mean thinking about money produces money. It never said that. The entire modern manifestation industry is built on a misreading of this one principle, and the misreading is so profitable that nobody selling it has any incentive to correct it. Interpretation determines your relationship to reality. It does not determine reality. Those are different sentences, and the gap between them has cost a lot of people a lot of years. Principle 2. Correspondence. As above, so below. As below, so above. We have already met this one on a green tablet in a tomb, and the kybalion inherits it directly. The claim is that the same patterns repeat at every scale of existence. So the small tells you about the large, and the large tells you about the small. The honest version is less cosmic and more useful. How you do anything is how you do everything. Your relationship with a 6 a.m. alarm and your relationship with a 5-year plan are the same relationship running at different scales. The way you handle a plate in the sink is the way you will handle a difficult conversation, which is the way you will handle a business under pressure. Not because of magic, because it is the same nervous system doing all 3, running the same default. So this principle is a diagnostic tool. You do not have to guess whether you are the kind of person who can execute on something enormous. Look at the small version. It is already visible today in what you do when nobody is checking. What it demands is that you stop treating small failures as small. There is no separate category called "it doesn't count." Every small version is a rehearsal for the large one, and you are rehearsing right now whether you meant to or not. Principle 3. Vibration. Nothing rests. Everything moves. Everything vibrates. At the physical level, this is straightforwardly correct. And the 1908 authors were writing at exactly the moment when physics was proving it. Atoms are in permanent motion. Matter and energy are two states of one thing. Nothing in the physical universe is actually still. The book extends this to mental states and claims every emotion, thought, and mood has its own rate of vibration, and that raising your own rate is a learnable skill. The physics of that extension is not real, and I am not going to pretend it is. But strip the vocabulary off, and there is a solid observation underneath. A mental state is not an object you own. It is a process that requires continuous input, and it decays the moment the input stops. This is why motivation is such a bad foundation. Motivation is a state, which means it is a process, which means it decays, and it usually decays about 48 hours after whatever produced it. Discipline works instead because it is not a state at all. It is a structure that keeps operating while the state is absent. What this principle demands is that you stop waiting to feel a certain way. The feeling is a wave. It is going to pass under you regardless. Build the thing that runs when the wave is gone. Principle 4. Polarity. This one is genuinely good, and it is the point where the book stops being interesting and starts being useful. The claim is that opposites are the same thing measured at different degrees. Hot and cold are not two substances. They are one scale, temperature, read at 2 points. And there is no line on a thermometer where heat ends and cold begins. The book applies this to everything: love and hate, courage and fear, confidence and doubt. And when you apply it to internal states, something practically valuable falls out. Fear and excitement are close to physiologically identical. Elevated heart rate, adrenaline, narrowed attention, tight breathing. The body produces one arousal response, and your brain then applies a label to it. There is a real line of psychological research on this, on deliberately relabeling anxiety as excitement before a high-pressure task. And the people who do it consistently perform better than the people trying to calm down, which is exactly what the kybalion says to do, 70 years before anyone ran the study. You cannot delete a pole. You can only slide along the scale toward the other end of it. Look at how the hardest people alive actually operate, and you will see this everywhere. Nobody who does difficult things has stopped feeling the fear or the pain. What they have done is stop treating the sensation as a verdict. The signal arrives. They relabel it and keep moving. What polarity demands is patience, and this is where it gets unglamorous. You cannot jump from one end of a scale to the other. You're not going to go from hating your work to loving it, and anyone selling you that jump is lying. You move a few degrees. Then you hold the new position until it is stable. Then a few more. Chapter 8. The last three and the master key. Principle 5. Rhythm. And in my opinion, this is the most valuable thing in the entire book. Everything swings. Everything has tides. Everything rises and falls. And here is the specific line that matters. The measure of the swing to the right is the measure of the swing to the left. Whatever height you reach, you will fall a matching distance on the return. The bigger the high, the bigger the corresponding low. That is not pessimism. That is a description of how you are built. And modern psychology has a name for the mechanism: hedonic adaptation. Your baseline resets. Every win normalizes. The promotion that was going to change everything stops registering in about 11 weeks. And almost everyone gets caught by this, every single time. They ride the swing up, they believe the height is permanent, And then the swing comes back through and takes them down to a depth they never planned for, and they call it a setback or a burnout or bad luck. But the kybalion is not just describing the pendulum. It gives you a technique, and it calls it neutralizing. You do not stop the swing. Nobody stops the swing. What you do is refuse to ride it. You position yourself at the upper end of the scale deliberately, and you let the backswing pass underneath you instead of carrying you with it. In plain language, you stop taking your emotional state as information about your life. The day you feel unstoppable and the day you feel like a fraud are both weather. Neither one is a report on your actual trajectory. If you make decisions on the peak, you will overcommit. And if you make decisions in the trough, you will quit something that was working. The rhythm is going to happen either way. Your only real choice is whether it gets to drive. What this demands is that you judge your life on the average and never on the extremes. And that you build systems designed for your worst week rather than your best one. If the plan only works when you feel good, you do not have a plan. Principle 6. Cause and effect. Every cause has its effect. Every effect has its cause. And then the line that does the real work. Chance is just a name for a law you have not recognized yet. The book claims nothing is random, that there are many levels of causation, and that a great many people spend their entire lives being effects rather than causes. Something happens, they react. Something else happens, they react to that. The reaction feels like a decision, but nothing in the chain originated with them. The book calls the alternative rising to the causal plane, which sounds mystical and is actually the most concrete instruction in the whole text. Everything you do sits somewhere on a line between stimulus and response. When that gap is zero, you are in effect. Something pushes and you move. Widen the gap even slightly. Put deliberation in the space, and you become a cause of what happens next. That is the entire skill. Almost everything else people call self-mastery is a subcategory of it. What it demands is genuinely unpleasant, because it means tracing your current situation backwards, honestly. Not to a villain, to a decision. Somewhere in the chain there is a choice you made, and finding it is the price of admission for changing the next link. Now, I want to be careful here, because this is the principle most easily weaponized. Plenty of things happen to people that they did not cause and could not have prevented. This principle does not mean you deserved what happened. It means that whatever happened, the next link in the chain is still available, and it is yours. Principle 7. Gender. And I am going to give you my honest read on this one, which is that it is the weakest chapter in the book. The claim is that everything contains a masculine and a feminine principle, that this has nothing to do with sex, and that all creation on every level requires both. The masculine principle projects and initiates. The feminine principle receives, holds, and develops. Written in 1908, and it reads like it. The vocabulary is dated, and the gendering of those two functions is a product of its moment rather than anything the authors demonstrated. If this chapter makes you wince, your instinct is reasonable. But there is something underneath it worth keeping, and it survives if you drop the labels entirely. Every act of creation needs two different capacities, and they are not the same capacity. One generates. It initiates, produces raw material, starts things, throws ideas outward. The other holds. It develops, refines, endures the slow, unglamorous middle, and carries a thing to completion. Almost everybody is heavily weighted toward one and starved on the other. There are people with 20 brilliant, unstarted ideas and no finished work. There are people who execute flawlessly on any instruction and never originate anything. Both are stuck, and they are stuck for opposite reasons. What it demands is that you identify which one you are, accurately, and then deliberately train the side you are bad at, which nobody wants to do, because the side you are bad at is uncomfortable, and the side you are good at is where the compliments live. And now the thing the 7 principles are actually for. The kybalion says that alchemy was never about metal. The lead and the gold were a cover story, and what the alchemists were really working on was the deliberate transformation of one mental state into another. The book calls this mental transmutation and calls it the master key. The 7 principles are the map. Transmutation is the operation you perform with it. Polarity tells you the scale exists. Rhythm tells you when the swing is against you. Vibration tells you the state will not hold itself. Cause and effect tells you where the gap is. Mentalism tells you why any of it moves at all. And every one of them is worthless as information. They only do anything when you are running them, under load, on a day you do not feel like it. Which brings us to the question I have been holding back for the entire video. Who actually wrote this? Chapter 9. The 300-Year Underground. Before I answer that, you need the 300 years I skipped. Because Casaubon demolished the foundation in 1614, and that raises an obvious problem. If the whole thing was discredited 3 centuries before anyone in Chicago picked it up, how did it survive the journey? The answer is that it stopped being scholarship and went underground, and it happened almost immediately. In the same year Casaubon published, 1614, a pamphlet came off a press in Kassel, in Germany, called the Fama Fraternitatis. It announced the existence of a secret brotherhood founded by a man named Christian Rosenkreutz, who had supposedly traveled to the East, acquired hidden knowledge, and been buried in a sealed vault that had recently been opened to reveal his perfectly preserved body and his books. A hidden chamber, a preserved corpse, recovered writings. If that sounds familiar, it should. It is Belinus and the Emerald Tablet, running again 800 years later in Lutheran Germany. 2 more pamphlets followed in 1615 and 1616. All of Europe went looking for the Brotherhood. Nobody ever found it, because it almost certainly did not exist. And the manifestos are widely thought to have started as a literary game by a small circle of German scholars. And it did not matter that it was fiction. Real organizations formed around it. Rosicrucianism became an actual current, and it fed into speculative Freemasonry as that spread across Britain and Europe through the 1700s, carrying hermetic symbolism, initiation grades, and the whole framework of hidden knowledge transmitted through a chain of initiates, which is where the word initiate stops being decorative and starts being an entire cultural machine. Then in 1875, in New York, Helena Blavatsky and Henry Steele Olcott founded the Theosophical Society, which taught that hidden masters in Tibet and India were guiding human spiritual evolution, and it authorized her to release fragments of their teaching. Theosophy went global, and it made Eastern and Egyptian esoteric material fashionable among educated Westerners for the first time. Then in 1888, in London, a group of Freemasons founded the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, working from a cipher manuscript of uncertain provenance, with a system of grades and a curriculum of Hermetic magic. William Butler Yeats was a member. So was Aleister Crowley. And running underneath all of it, in America, was something plainer and more practical. New Thought. New Thought started with a Maine clockmaker named Phineas Quimby, who worked as a healer and concluded that a great deal of illness was produced by false belief and could be cleared by correcting the belief. his students spread that outward. Emma Curtis Hopkins taught a generation of the movement's leaders. By the 1890s, there were magazines, lecture circuits, correspondence courses, and churches. And New Thought had a quality none of the European occult orders had. It was for ordinary people. It had no initiation fee and no secret grades, and it promised results you could check. Better health, better work, better money. That is the current a broken lawyer stepped into when he had lost everything. Atkinson did not invent any of this. He inherited 300 years of it. Rosicrucian secrecy, Masonic initiation language, theosophical hidden masters, and New Thought's practical promise, all sitting there. And he was a professional publisher who understood exactly what an American reader in 1908 would find credible. So when he needed an authority for the 7 principles, he did not have to think hard. 3 initiates, a sealed teaching, an Egyptian source. Every single one of those moves had been running successfully in Western culture since before Casaubon. He was not being original. He was using a template that had worked over and over for 2,000 years, and he knew it. And it is worth asking why that template keeps working, because it tells you something uncomfortable about how you evaluate ideas. A teaching presented as freely available gets judged on its content. A teaching presented as recovered from a sealed vault gets judged on its story. And the story does most of the persuading before you have read a single line. Scarcity makes things feel valuable. Secrecy makes them feel true. Neither of those has anything to do with whether the thing actually works. Every single figure in this video understood that. From Balanas to the Rosicrucians, to Blavatsky, to Atkinson. They were not all cynics. But they all knew that people will do things for a secret that they will not do for advice. Chapter 10. The Man in the Masonic Temple. William Walker Atkinson was born in Baltimore in 1862 and became a lawyer in Pennsylvania. By his 30s, he had a successful practice, and then he lost everything. The accounts describe a total physical, mental, and financial collapse brought on by overwork. Not a bad quarter. A man broken down to nothing by the pace he had set himself. And I want you to hold that, because it changes the moral of this entire story. He came back through the New Thought movement, the American current that held that mental states shape physical outcomes. Whatever you think of the metaphysics, it worked on him. He recovered his health, recovered his finances, moved to Chicago, and became one of the most prolific writers in the history of American esoteric publishing. And the volume of output is genuinely difficult to comprehend. He edited magazines, he ran a publishing operation, he produced something in the region of 100 books on breathing, on memory, on concentration, on yoga, on salesmanship, on the subconscious, across roughly 3 decades, while also practicing law again in Illinois. This was a man who had been reduced to nothing by overwork, and whose recovery method produced a working life more punishing than the one that broke him. Make of that what you like. I find it the most human thing in this entire story. And here is where the story gets uncomfortable. Atkinson almost never published under his own name. He wrote as Yogi Ramacharaka, presented to American readers as an authentic Indian yogi, and those books sold enormously. He wrote as Theron Q. Dumont, a supposed French expert on personal magnetism. He wrote as Swami Panchadasi. He wrote as Magus Incognito. Different authorities, different traditions, different continents. One man in Chicago. So in 1908, when a book appeared from the Yogi Publication Society at an address in the Masonic Temple building in Chicago, credited to 3 initiates and claiming to transmit the sealed teaching of Hermes Trismegistus, It was published by the same operation, out of the same office, that had been manufacturing exotic authorities for a decade. And the tell is right there in the title. There is no kybalion in Egyptian literature. There is no kybalion in the Greek hermetic corpus, in the Arabic transmission, in the medieval Latin, in Ficino, in anything. The word does not exist before 1908. Atkinson invented it, which means the book is doing something quite bold. Throughout the text, it quotes from a document called the Kybalion, in bold, as an ancient authority backing up each principle. Those quotations have no source. He wrote them, then quoted them, then attributed them to a book that had never existed, inside the book he was writing. The scholarship on this is settled. The religious historian Philippe Delip did the definitive work on it, and his edition of the text lays out the case in full. And the clearest piece of evidence is a book Atkinson published 4 years later, in 1912, under his own name, through the same publisher. It is called The 7 Cosmic Laws, and it covers the same 7 principles in the same structure and the same voice, with no initiates anywhere in sight. He rewrote his own anonymous masterpiece under his real name, and nobody noticed for the better part of a century. So the obvious verdict is fraud. And I want to argue with that slightly, because I think it is too easy. A fraud sells something he knows does not work. Atkinson was selling the only thing that had ever worked on him. He had been destroyed. He had rebuilt himself using these ideas, and he then spent 30 years trying to hand the method to as many people as possible. The lie was in the packaging and never in the product. And he was operating in a market where an American reader in 1908 would not buy mental discipline from a Chicago lawyer, but would absolutely buy it from an Egyptian priesthood. He knew what would get through the door, so he built a door that is still deception, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. But it is a specific kind, and it is worth being precise about which kind, because the answer changes what you should do with the book. And now look at what that forgery went on to do. It ran into the American success literature that followed it. Napoleon Hill's Think and Grow Rich came out in 1937 and became the founding document of the entire self-improvement industry. And it sits directly downstream of the new thought current Atkinson helped define. Norman Vincent Peale in 1952. The Secret in 2006, which put a diluted version of Principle 1 in front of tens of millions of people who had never heard the word hermetic in their lives. It went somewhere else too. And this part gets left out of most tellings. Black nationalist and Black African-centered study groups took the kybalion up seriously through the 20th century, and they did something Atkinson had not. They put the credit back where the book itself pointed, to Egypt, to Africa, to Tahuti. For a lot of people, that book was the door into an entire tradition of study, and it functioned as a claim on an intellectual inheritance that had been systematically denied. It shows up in modern witchcraft. It shows up in Salem, in the founding texts of contemporary Wicca. It shows up in 100,000 videos, including, in a sense, this one. A book with a made-up title, quoting a made-up source, written by a bankrupt lawyer under a fake name, became one of the most widely read works of philosophy of the 20th century and has never once gone out of print. So the obvious question is whether the whole thing is worthless. And the answer is no. And the reason why is the best idea in this entire story. Chapter 11. Why the fake works. Go back over the whole chain with me, because the shape of it is the point. The Egyptians had books of Thoth, and their own literature says those books destroy anyone who takes them without earning them. The Corpus Hermeticum was written by anonymous people in Roman Egypt under a borrowed divine name. The emerald tablet came out of a tomb nobody has located, translated from a Greek original that does not exist. Ficino's corpus reshaped Europe on the strength of a date that was wrong by 1,500 years. And the kybalion quotes a book that was never written. 5 transmissions, 5 missing originals, 2,000 years, and there has never been a verified chain of custody at any point in the entire tradition. That is not a flaw in the story. That is the story. Because think about what actually determines whether a text survives. Before printing, a document only continued to exist if a human being was willing to spend weeks of their life copying it out by hand. Nobody did that for authenticity. They did it because the thing in front of them changed how they operated, and they wanted it to still be there in 50 years. So the tradition was never filtered for accuracy. It was filtered brutally and continuously for usefulness. Everything that did not work on real people got dropped because nobody bothered to copy it again. What reached you passed through 2,000 years of that filter. Which brings us back to the first principle and to the reason I built this whole video around it. The all is mind. If that is true even in the weak operational sense we talked about, then the effect an idea has on you was never coming from the tomb it was found in. It was coming from what your mind did with it. An idea is not a relic whose value depends on its provenance. It is an instruction, and an instruction is judged by what happens when you run it. Atkinson's book is a forgery that teaches that the origin of a thing matters less than the mind receiving it. And then it proves its own thesis by working anyway, which gives you a test you can apply to everything, not just this. There are 2 completely different things a book can lie about. It can lie about where it came from, or it can lie about what happens when you use it. The first one is a question about history, and you settle it with scholarship. The second one is a question about results, and you settle it by running the thing. Atkinson lied about the first and told the truth about the second. The manifestation industry that descends from him usually does the reverse, and that is the far more expensive lie, because you can survive a wrong date forever, and you cannot survive a method that does not work. So stop asking texts where they came from as your first question. Ask them what they want you to do, then go and do it for 90 days, and let the results file the report. And now the hard part, because I am not going to leave you on a comfortable note. Everything I have just described is dangerous in the wrong hands, and it has been in the wrong hands for about 20 years. If you take mentalism and remove the discipline, you get delusion with a better vocabulary. If you take polarity and remove the patience, you get people expecting to feel different by Friday. If you take cause and effect and remove the honesty, you get someone blaming a victim for their own vibration. That is not the tradition. That is what happens when you take the map and refuse the walk. Read the 7 principles again and notice what every single one of them actually describes. Continuous effortful reframing, auditing your smallest habits, building structures that survive the absence of motivation, moving 1 degree at a time and holding the position, refusing to ride your own emotional weather, inserting deliberation into the gap between stimulus and response, training the capacity you are worst at. Not one of those is a shortcut. Every one of them is work, described in mystical language by someone who knew that most readers would prefer the language to the work. Strip all of it back, the Atlantis claims and the Emerald and the initiates who never existed, and you are left with the oldest version. A god with the head of a bird, standing beside a scale, writing down what is actually there. He does not get to decide it, and he does not get to soften it. He writes down what the scale did. There is a part of you that already does that job. It knows exactly what you did this week and exactly what you avoided, and it is not interested in your explanation. Every tradition in this video, across 2,000 years and 4 languages, was pointing at that same function and trying to get you to listen to it. That is Thoth's reality. Everything else is packaging. So you have the whole chain now: an Egyptian scribe god, a Greek merger in Ptolemaic Alexandria, a tablet in an Arabic tomb, a dying Medici who put Plato down, a philologist who dismantled it all with a vocabulary list, and a broken lawyer in Chicago who rebuilt himself and then handed the method to a century of readers under a name that was not his. And 7 principles that are still doing work on people this morning. If you want the other half of this, the practical half, I broke down the discipline framework that Goggins arrived at from the opposite direction, with no mysticism in it at all. And watching those 2 systems land on the same conclusions is worth your time. It is on screen now. Click it.